Great. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're joining from. Great to have so many of you in this conversation. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive at ODI. I'm really delighted to be moderating such an important conversation tonight. No justice, no peace. This has been a rallying cry of protest throughout the world this year. And I think we've seen how the pandemic has really brought the deep inequalities that exist in our societies to the fore and has fed frustration about justice systems that fail to achieve fair outcomes for everyone. So in order really to deliver on SDG 16, to provide equal access to justice for all by 2030, we've seen a global movement for people-centered justice that has been gaining steam. And I think this was really sparked by the Justice for All report that was published in 2019 by the Pathfinders Task Force on Justice. So we'll actually look closer at what the events of 2020 teach us about the relation between justice, inclusion, and peace. We'll discuss the interlinkages between unmet legal needs and systemic inequalities. But very importantly, we will look at how people-centered justice approaches can contribute to violence prevention, can contribute to help build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. This is an important time to really reflect on the challenges that the pandemic has created for the ability of justice actors to resolve people's justice problems, and what really the implications for peace are, for the ability of people to participate fully in their society, in the economy, and importantly for the structural inequalities and injustices that we are failing to tackle collectively. And I've got a fantastic panel with me to discuss these issues this evening here in London. I'm joined by Rodrigo Oprimni, who is the Director for Drug Policy Area of De Justicia in Colombia and the former Director of De Justicia. I have Florence Simbiri, who is a Kenyan lawyer and lecturer at the University of Nairobi. Martin Rupia, who is a Training and Innovations Manager at Accord in South Africa, and Liv Torres, who is the Director of Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies. Do make sure the most important, the most interesting snippets of the conversation get fed more globally by using Twitter. The hashtag is PeaceCon 2020. This is just the conversation is for just those who are joining the conference, but we can share some of the insights with a larger group of colleagues out there. I will ask my colleagues to really help provide examples of some of the strategic bottom-up legal mobilization that we've seen this year, the creative ways in which justice actors have worked to resolve, to prevent people's justice problems, within the context of the countries in which they work, and really, in the frame of different political contexts of violence, of social injustice, of conflict, and what different degrees of transformative impact they have achieved. So I'll start with Martin, who, as I was saying, is joining us from South Africa. So Martin, can you share your reflections on what you think the most important societal reactions to the pandemic in South Africa have been over the past years? Tell us both about the demonstrations, the increase in violence and unrest, but also the impact that the pandemic has had on people's justice problems and the access to opportunities that exist in South Africa.
Well, yes, thanks, Sarah, and my apologies to my colleagues, but thanks to your team for helping me on. The context in which the violence occurred is, at least in South Africa and on the continent, was against the background of governments attempting to flatten the curve, but also to increase investment in infrastructure, particularly public health, and which meant adopting a strategy of lockdowns. We introduced a new word of restrictions. And in many cases, areas of informal settlement and areas in which the most vulnerable very quickly ran out of food and other, amenities. And they will try and break out of the control measures that the state had imposed. And this is where the clashes and violence begin to take place. And earlier, in a comparative term, we also had similar incidents in Kenya and also in Nigeria, in which generally around, the informal settlements, uh, the armed forces or security apparatuses came into contact, with the public, and there was violence. So on the one hand, there was the need to rethink how you could assist the most vulnerable, but on the other hand, trying to flatten the curve, as it were. What we saw, not only particularly in South Africa, but also in Kenya and Nigeria, and I'm glad my colleague Florence is here, was that governments were forced to adjust the curfews that they had imposed to allow more time for the informal sector of the economies that takes place in these areas to begin to function. In Nigeria, for example, the curfews were lifted and could only be imposed around nearly midnight or 11 at night. And very early in the morning also, people were allowed to interact. And so it is in that a manner that the impact of what the World Bank and others were discussing from April around, debt, stress countries who needed support, with station on the streets, as it were, of the informal settlements.
Are you, are you still with us, Martin?
I am, and I'm hoping
Okay,
you
great,
heard
great.
what I said.
We might have lost it here. No. We heard it very well. So yes, and what do you think the key reflections really from you on the response from the justice actors that you think you would bring out, to exemplify how they try to address the issues?
Well, in the first instance, what we saw was government had put into place in South Africa a welfare handout of just about $50 to everyone, employed, non-employed, as a safety measure. Initially suggested for 3 months, but after they realized that the hunger and poverty was in fact increasing, that period was extended. And for now, they're even talking of even perhaps, to go through 1 year, providing that, social support to the most vulnerable. So I think it's one area that governments were forced to create and put into place a social welfare system. Whereas in the past, many African governments had not necessarily thought about or considered putting into place social welfare system within an area where communities were surviving on their own. So I think it is one important outcome, but also remember, particularly also on the African continent, the same period that the pandemic struck also witnessed the collapse in the commodity pricing, particularly for Nigeria, for example, the price of oil. And this is where government derives some 90% of its revenue. So you have now governments that may consider to provide the social welfare system, but without the necessary resources that they are traditionally expecting to receive. And coming out of COVID going forward, this is an important, I think, indication where both governments and communities will need international support of some form to be able to survive.
Thanks, Martin. Let me come to Florence and hear the experience from Kenya. Again, and Florence, I would ask you to, reflect both of what we've seen in terms of the reaction from the public and how justice actors, have engaged and what the outcomes have been. I think you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe you can hear me. Okay, so just to continue where Martin has left off, as he has indicated, the experiences in Kenya were quite similar. This is in South Africa and other parts of Africa. And I think one of the greatest concerns that emerged in terms of the access to justice and issues related to justice was what became very clear earlier on, that the government decided to address the pandemic as a security issue as opposed to as a public health issue. So there was almost this absolute reliance on the security agents to enforce, whether it was the curfew, the rules for wearing masks, for keeping social distancing. So all these things that were very new to citizens were being enforced by the security agents. Now, the security agents themselves were not prepared. They had not been prepared for this new role, as it were, that they were embarking on. And I think that in Kenya, what then happened is that our security law enforcement agencies have had a history of being very heavy-handed, of exercising their mandate with a lot of impunity. And it was clear that immediately they were deployed to enforce these new regulations and new rules, that they went into their mode, and their mode was to intimidate, to beat up people, and it was totally unacceptable, the kind of things that happened. So for things that, in my view, the state should have been more persuasive, explaining to citizens that this is a public health, concern, that there's need for everyone to take care of themselves and to take care of others, and that together we can be able to actually fight the pandemic. The narrative became that the security agencies were able to fight the pandemic. So instead of the pandemic being the main threat, security agents became the main threat. And in Kenya, there were protests about the way that the police, especially, were deploying their powers and their mandates. And there was a lot of social media activity. So different incidents were captured even by ordinary persons. And these incidents were then circulated, hashtags were created. And as a result, there was some level of I would say, oversight over what the police were doing. Some civil society organizations also took the police to court to try and hold them accountable to the manner in which they were using their powers. Now, I think that for me, one of the concerns, and I think one of the challenges with this intersection between the pandemic, security, and justice is the idea that for those who are most at risk, the most vulnerable persons, and as Martin has indicated, in Kenya, the most vulnerable persons are the persons who live in informal sectors. Most of them, especially the ones who, their employment, there's opportunities for employment are very, very minimal. They rely on face-to-face employment opportunities. And with the lockdown and, the curfews that were enforced, it meant that they became even more vulnerable. And then to deploy the security agencies in a way that was not securing their rights, in a way that was not securing their dignity, was really totally an affront in my view, to what Kenya has signed up to as a member of the international community, and also what we have signed up to in our constitution, which is to treat everyone with dignity and with respect. So dignity and respect for these vulnerable persons was actually thrown through the window. And to make it worse, they were also the ones who are suffering most with regard to economic and social challenges. So as Martin has mentioned, most of them could not afford food. Their housing situations were under threat because they could not pay rents. The public health facility sanitation in most of these communities was absent. So not only were they at risk because of the pandemic itself, but also the situation that the pandemic now actually exposed about their very, very vulnerable circumstances. So I think that that was something that in Kenya became very evident. And obviously the health facilities, which have always been in shambles, became evident for everyone that the state was not in a position to provide the kind of health care that the pandemic requires, and especially providing it on an equal basis for everyone who was affected. So we ended up with only those who are, especially the elite, those who have money, because insurance companies were also not providing cover for the pandemic. So it meant that communities, families that were already very devastated by the pandemic were now at even a higher risk if they got the virus. And then it also meant that a lot of people did not want to come out for testing, because testing then also unraveled another serious challenge of having to be quarantined, having to pay for quarantine. So it was, I think it was really, really challenging for vulnerable persons in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence. You paint a very vivid, very clear picture of the challenges in Kenya, which I'm sure resonated with other countries. Rodrigo, let me come to you. Tell us a little bit about how this was, how this played out in Colombia. Again, the impact in terms of the demonstrations, the increasing violence, but particularly the implications in the context of implementing the peace agreement. With all the associated challenges it already has.
Thank you for the question, and good afternoon for everyone from Colombia. In Colombia, this relationship between justice and peace, and the idea of no justice, no peace, I think has to be analyzed at two levels: in relation to the peace process, the peace agreement with the FARC, and in the other fields. In relation to the peace accord, as you know, this peace accord was an effort to put an end to the very long and protracted armed conflict in Colombia, while at the same time respecting the rights of victims and the duty of states to prosecute heinous crimes. And that's, as we know, is a very tricky and difficult balance to reach. The peace accord then established a special justice mechanism, the so-called HEP, because of its initials in Spanish, in which those who are responsible for international crimes have to go and provide truth. If they do it, they do not receive amnesty, as it was the case in South Africa, but they do not go to jail either. They receive an alternative sanction, a restriction of freedom for 5 to 8 years, in which they will have to develop restorative personal works in favor of peace or in favor of the victims, such as the mining. I think that this is a very creative mechanism to harmonize peace and justice in a difficult context, but it has been also controversial for many Colombians. The HEP has been functioning for the last 3 years, and some very important results have been already achieved. For instance, the acknowledgement of systematic kidnappings by the former guerrillas and extrajudicial killings by members of the Colombian army. However, the political situation remains very unstable, and some, even in the government, wants to reform deeply the help at that same moment that I'm speaking here. The pandemic has made this situation much more difficult because the functioning of the help was affected, especially in the region. It has become more difficult to operate. And mobilization, social mobilization in favor of peace have become very difficult because of the restrictions of the freedom of movement because of the pandemic. In the other fields, that is, fields not related with the peace process, the Colombian situation in relation to what we call here people-centered justice is a kind of paradox, because in the last 20 years there have been important improvements in access to justice thanks to the 1991 constitutions that established some very efficient mechanisms to protection of constitutional rights, such as the so-called tutela. But at the same time, access to justice remained very unequal in the country. In that context, the pandemic has increased this paradox. Citizens have tried to use the mechanisms, the efficient constitutional mechanisms to combat the more negative aspects of the policies of the government in relation to the pandemic. For instance, to avoid discrimination in the measures taken to combat the pandemic. For instance, there was a constitutional challenge to the more severe restriction for people, for the old people. We call that in Colombia the gray hair revolt, and it functioned. There was also mechanisms to avoid the abuse of emergency powers or to strengthen the social protection of the most disadvantaged in the context of the pandemic. As changes have functioned, Colombia has a tradition of a quite independent judiciary, but I think that the existence of the pandemic, the dilemmas and the challenges that the pandemic creates has made that the judiciary has been, if you want, too differential to the government. And so it has accepted a lot of emergency measures that I think were controversial, a lot of restrictions of freedom that I think were not acceptable. And so I think that the pandemic has created a more, at the same time, it has allowed the judiciary to combat some of the aspects of the policy, as I said, discrimination against all people, but at the same time has made much more difficult the functioning of the judicial system. Thank you very much.
Very interesting, very vivid depiction of what has been going on in Colombia. Liv, let me come to you. We've heard some three very powerful stories of the very deep impact that the pandemic has had on, the dynamics of violence and access to justice in three countries as well as others in the region in Africa. How do this experience fit with the global trends on peace, justice, and inclusion from where you sit and the trends you analyze? But particularly, tell us, in terms of people-centered justice, the urgency of transforming the justice systems. How can we use this moment in a more positive way? We've heard of a number of the negative impact of the pandemic. Is there a positive that we can take? You're muted.
Sound now, huh? Very good. Now, let me first say that I think these stories are very powerful. I'm in no doubt that there are millions of people out there that are desperate. They are desperately searching for livelihood for themselves, for their children, for their families. I'm also in no doubt that we will see this crisis lasting for a long time, because several countries are already experiencing economic problems. We knew from the start that the health crisis would last maybe a year or so. The economic crisis stemming from it would last a few more years. And the political crisis and possible violence would last even longer. So we are going to live with this crisis for quite a long time. I'm also in no doubt that the stories I hear from Kenya, South Africa, reference to Nigeria, the stories from Colombia that are very strong and make an impact, they are also at the same time not unique. There's a reason why we are seeing that people are reacting, polarization is growing, and people are marching in many parts of the world and demonstrating in different ways. If I can just sort of take half a step back, we already had massive challenges beforehand, before the pandemic. 5 billion people, more than 5 billion people, were experiencing struggles getting access to the justice system. We had massive structural failures in the justice system in treating people fairly, giving people access to the justice system. Now, why is that important? It's important because millions of people around the world were not having their issues dealt with by the justice apparatus. They were therefore also not covered by their legal rights. They didn't have acceptance or respect for their human rights, and they didn't have any way of solving their grievances peacefully in the justice system. Now, it was very interesting. I was reading the Pathways for Peace report recently, and I just checked, it's a nerdy thing to do, but I just checked how many times justice and injustice was mentioned. This is a World Bank UN report from a while back, before the pandemic, of course, and it was mentioned 225 times. And they are saying in the report that just injustice and inequalities is becoming a higher and higher and higher risk of causing violence and conflict. Now, there are many disagreements among academics as to what causes conflict and what causes violence. We will have situations where inequalities have existed for a long time without that causing violence. We've also had situations with injustices over many years that have not caused violence. But what we do know is that when inequalities, when despair and poverty becomes too dramatic, it becomes a vulnerable situation and the risk of violence increases. And we also know that when inequalities and injustices overlap, then the risk is increasing considerably. And I'll explain what I mean. You will have millions of people who already have a justice gap problem. They don't have access to their legal rights, to the justice system. They're not covered by grievance procedures. They never see a lawyer, etc. But that is their one problem, their first problem, their one injustice. But you add to that the fact that they see other people getting access to the justice system or getting access to resources because of them having more resources, or because they have another skin color, or because they have another gender, or because they have another religion. And discrimination like that adds to the injustice that was there already. And that causes not only frustration, despair, and problems for the individuals, but it easily also creates marches, polarization, anger, and more often violence. We've known this for years. Overlapping injustices, multiple injustices, discrimination on top of resource shortages and injustices in the first place are causing major violence issues and conflict easily.
Thanks, Liv. You touched on a very important point, and I'd like to hear the views of the others, because this exclusionary sort of justice access, discriminatory, it becomes justice for few rather than for all, as you say, has a direct impact on the ability to achieve peace, or creates violence in a number of situations. Florence, you were getting to some of this, I think, in your remarks. I would like to hear your reflections on, really the connection between diffusing violence, building peace where there is an active conflict, and the need to provide equal justice for all. And I'll try to bring all of you. So if you can be brief in our remarks, okay, we'll have more discursive conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I really want to associate with what Liv has said, because I think that one of the challenges that we have is that, first of all, in countries like in African countries, sometimes even the concept and the type of justice systems that we have are very alienating from the people. And starting from that alienation, when they now have serious challenges, it becomes extremely difficult for them to associate with this justice system that they've always seen to be, very distant from them. Mm. And I think that in terms of trying to, in a sense, to bridge the gap, that there's need for justice, as we are saying, to be more people-centered, and to try as much as possible to informalize some of the justice processes that we have. And I think that in terms of the security sector, for example, there's not been a lot of investment in this idea of community policing, for example. Because I think that if people are so dissatisfied, whether with their economic or social circumstances, as we are seeing now, which is then aggravated by their interactions with the security agents, and as Liv has properly said, if they can be able to look at others and see that, well, there are people who are actually benefiting from this situation, and we are at a disadvantage. So then the security sector becomes a very critical agent in being a peace agent. But if they've not been interacting with the community, they do not have that relationship with the community, then it becomes extremely difficult for them to be this agent of peace. So I think that at the lowest level, I would argue that security agents can do a better job by adopting community policing and getting to know their communities, and the communities getting to know them, so that some of the problems can actually be sorted at the earliest possible level without going to the court system that may be very alien to a majority of the people.
And that's a very important point. Liv, you want to come in on this?
Yes, please. I think I'm just following up from Florence. There's no doubt that we need to transform the justice system, and there are many ways of doing this. A lot of the issues that people are now struggling with are issues around labor markets, jobs, retrenchments, land issues, domestic violence, and there are ways to address this, which is closer to the people, people-centered justice. We're talking paralegals, we're talking informal systems of following up with lawyers, we're talking community centers with legal services, we're talking about mediation by local communities, follow up by crisis centers and shelters on domestic violence. There are so many other ways to address this also that we now need to investigate more thoroughly, that ways that are cheaper, more efficient in reaching people, basically.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Martin, is that your reflections also from the experience of South Africa? Because you were getting to some of that in your remarks as well.
Certainly, I want to make 2 points, Sarah, if I may. And one of them is about what we call civil-military relations that Florence is referring to, that they really saw on the ground in Kenya. Now, for all the countries that adopted the strategy to fight the pandemic, what has not been apparent and important in the justice discussion is that the countries set aside normal constitutional frameworks and then invoked national security emergency laws, which would be under the presidency. And it is in that context that they would then deploy troops on the ground and try and manage the process. If one takes a measurement of how the troops were deployed and to what extent did that contribute towards strengthening the public sector or the public health system, then you can begin to see how flawed the strategy adopted by many countries. And because they dislocated the normal constitutional frameworks, the participation and the violence and the clash between communities and the security establishment, they were immune to any communities, attempting to take them to court. And this is an important, I think, observation that tends to get missed. In other words, the framework in which the response to the pandemic was in the abnormal context of setting aside the Constitution. The second point, very briefly, is to also bring to the table the character of care homes or the elderly, or even people that needed to have access to health facilities. Once the restrictions were imposed, as we have seen in Europe, in the States and other places, the greatest community that was impacted were the elderly in the care homes. Not so in our African countries. The elderly are amongst us. As Africans, we take pride in looking after our elderly. We don't take them to homes. And yet the impact was the greatest, on the elderly. And so when we come out of the justice and injustice, one has to take into account, Sarah, the last 2 points, both the culture and context on the one hand, and also the phenomena of setting aside normal constitutional provisions in which the responses were adopted.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, there is a bit of a theme that's coming out. Clearly with the pandemic, we've seen, the exceptionality of the moment being seized, to suspend some of the constitutional provisions to, as Rodrigo was saying, we've seen this, differential attitudes, to governments that even, the justice sector becomes, way less of independent. The challenges are clear. On the other hand, we've also seen popular movement, they've been inspired to take the streets to demand, sort of greater access to justice or greater justice, really. So, we've reflected quite a bit on the challenges. Rodrigo, do you want to reflect perhaps also on what opportunities, how we see this, these little glimmers of opportunities that we see, particularly from, the popular movements that have been inspired to take the streets, perhaps also in reaction to, the extent to which the state may have, overreached in some cases.
Thank you. It's a very difficult question. If I can come back a little to the previous question and then I go back to this one. In relation to the previous question, I think that if you made a sociological inquiry of inequality in societies before access to justice and inequality in societies after access to justice, something like the economy is made in relation to taxes, I would say that in general, the judicial system all over the world is more regressive than redistributive, because in general, those who access to justice are middle class and high income families. So there is a challenge if we want to make access to justice really equal. And I think that if you see the experience of our countries, I would say that at least you have to develop 3 mechanisms if you want to have really a people-centered justice. First, as Florence and Liv said, we need to recognize and strengthen the community mechanism of justice. That state should support this mechanism that sometimes function much better than the judicial system. Second, we have to create mechanisms to remove obstacles for access to justice of the poorest persons in society. For instance, in some cases, not requiring a lawyer to go to the justice. In Colombia, the best experience in that is what I call the tutela. The tutela works in a very informal way and can go even to the highest courts in the country for the protection of constitutional rights. And third, I think that we have to support mechanisms like the Human Rights National Institution to support people who cannot access a lawyer to receive social legal advice. So with this mechanism, I think we can reduce this unequal access to justice. But I think I don't have time now for emergency powers.
I'll ask colleagues to zoom back so that you can answer my second question.
Okay, I'm sorry. In relation to emergency powers, there is a tendency when you leave an emergency that all people said we need a very powerful executive branch in order to face the emergency, and that's a very serious risk of undermining democracy in these emergency times. So I think that we should stress this idea that sometimes seems counterintuitive, that human rights are not a thing that is important in normal times, but especially in emergency times. That is at that time that judges become very important as guardians of the executive in order to avoid the arbitrary that was described by Martin. And I think that the balance is mixed. As I said, in Colombia, some things were achieved and the judges controlled some abuses, but they were too differential in relation to the government for others. So I think that's a real challenge for this very complex time. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, I'd be interested to hear more also from Kenya, Florence. What has been the role of informal justice actors to try and address, some of these people's justice problems?
So I think that the role of informal justice processes in Kenya, especially in some communities, is very well established. So there are communities that even before the pandemic, they've always used community-based systems. And fortunately for Kenya, the constitution now also recognizes these traditional mechanisms. And to the credit of the judiciary, they've actually decided that they are bringing these mechanisms under their umbrellas so that they can be able to monitor and also give them support. So in a lot of communities where these mechanisms work, the judiciary itself, as the formal justice system, has given them recognition and is working with them to, especially in areas where they may not be very gender sensitive, where sometimes they don't take into account issues such as persons with disabilities and minorities. So I think that in that regard, there's a lot of work that the Kenyan judiciary, as the formal and the primary mandate holder, has done to try and ensure that these mechanisms don't die off completely. Now, the challenge is that in urban areas, and especially as Martin also mentioned, in most urban areas, in slum areas, people have disconnected from these traditional mechanisms. So they are not very well connected to their culture. And there's been a lot, I think that we need to do a lot of work in reinforcing the idea that these mechanisms, even though they are informal, that they are respected and that they can be recognized as part of the structures of justice that we have. So I think that's an area that we still need to really work on in the urban areas, and especially even amongst the elite, that if you think about gender-based violence and some things that happen in very private spaces and are culturally accepted, then the formal court systems may not deal with them to the extent of changing culture and attitude. So I think that we really need to work very closely with them.
Thanks, Florence. Liv, have you seen these new forms of collaboration between the most formal justice sector and this sort of, if you want, the more informal justice actors be strengthened, come to the fore more during the pandemic, or has it been worse? You're muted.
In informal systems, we've also seen grassroots organizations mobilizing. We've seen innovation when it comes to justice system. But I do think we need even more of all of this. We need more innovation. We need more exchange of experiences. We need more mobilization of grassroots organizations. When the crisis started, we said from the very beginning that we now need to think in a long-term perspective, because the crisis hits and everyone will focus on health. And yes, it was important to focus on health, and it still is. But many of us knew that there would be added problems coming out and spillover effects and economic crisis, political, etc. And we needed to plan for that from the beginning. Now, it's not too late. We need to think urgency of the situation. I think we need to think through prevention and conflict resolutions, how to mediate issues and problems, how to set up different and new structures at the local level in order to mediate conflicts, or at the workplace where employee representatives can sit with employers, or if there's a union there or collective agreement, to take on new roles. There are so many new ways we can think and should think around this. And can I just add one last thing? I think a lot of people think about, the justice system, and there's a crisis, we need to focus on other things. No, the justice system becomes more important in a crisis in order to avoid the risk rising of this crisis becoming into 10 other crises. Secondly, and lastly, some people will think about the costs. Okay, so then we need to think through, even more reason to think through informal systems, cheaper systems, other ways of doing things. The cost is a factor, but it is an investment. If we invest in resolving people's injustice problems and grievances and issues around work or land or violence, we will get so much back. The task force report showed very clearly the value add of investments in this area.
Great, thanks. Just a reminder to the audience that in 5 minutes I will start asking your questions. Actually, I can already see some questions. So Martin, maybe I'll ask you the first question from the audience, because they've been active in already sort of placing questions there. So there's a question from Prabha Sankanarayan. I hope I've pronounced that okay. So one of the participants reflected on the situation in Kenya. So that's more a question to Florence, sorry, but perhaps both Florence and Martin can address that. And indicated that while the security sector was very unprepared, peace-building leaders with greater credibility than the police stepped in. They shared healthcare guidance along with soap and buckets. So that was an interesting pivot on the part of peace leaders. What does this tell us about the role of different actors and how they can collaborate better? And it speaks a bit to Liv's point as well about this creativity that we need to unlock in finding, different ways to work also with different justice and security actors. I don't know, Martin, if you want to address that first, or Florence, since it was specific to Kenya, but I think it's a more general point as well.
Yes, it is a general point, but let me take a stab and then allow my sister Florence to then finish off. One of the things that was very quickly apparent in this, almost suspending of constitutional frameworks was that a number of presidents then took the decision whether or not to carry out elections in a number of countries. And the point is this, that, our country, Kenya, has had a number of challenges around electoral processes. And certainly in the debates around civil-military relations, the relations between society and the police is one that has been forced to become, in some areas, contentious. And so COVID-19 simply exacerbated that situation. Florence was saying that, the security forces need more training, for example. And it was clear in the very early stages, of COVID-19 that the armed police, even in South Africa, had very little training in policing their own communities. Remember, the borders were closed. The workplaces were shut down, and the communities were, expected to stay indoors under curfew or no curfew without movement. And very quickly we realized that the training ethos and focus of the police or the armed forces is inadequate in looking after the whole nation, as it were, locking it down. And so I think there's a gap there. That community policing, for example, is something that has to be thought through and encouraged, allowing the community not to undertake what we have seen as vigilantes, but simply community-based policing, which draws from the community and also protects the same community. So that's one area. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that on the one hand, the traditional justice system and the customary processes continue to operate. However, when areas were shut down, the interaction by communities and societies with the traditional and customary systems was also disrupted. And it is something that, going forward, we need to, take into account, because the formal, justice system is incapable of handling all the issues that, confront our societies. So, Florence, you may wish to conclude, part of the discussion, the question that arose.
Thanks, Martin.
Martin, I think one of the observations that I've seen from the chat was about also the initiatives that communities and civil society took. Now, an interesting thing with the security sector managing the pandemic in Kenya was just the sight of policemen parked in vehicles, in lorries with no masks, actually going to carry out their policing duties on COVID-19. And I think that was just something that made it so evident that the police had not been trained on their own security and on their own measures on how to protect themselves. And there was also no plan by the state on actually providing them with the basic requirements. So some of the actually very interesting initiatives that took place, especially within the city, that some organizations, so there are civil society organizations, there were faith-based organizations that went to police stations and provided them with masks, provided them with sanitizers, and actually enhanced their own ability to then go out and carry out their policing. So I think that those were opportunities, and I think they still exist because the pandemic obviously has revealed that it's no respecter of persons, and that we all need each other ultimately, and that public security is so important. If we can't provide safe, secure societies for everyone, even during this pandemic, then even when we are talking about SDGs, we will never develop, because without safe, secure systems where people can feel free to go out and try and return back to their normal, it will not be possible. So I think that that's an area that was very interesting. With regard to the traditional mechanisms, I think one of the challenges with the pandemic is that traditional mechanisms actually rely a lot on the face-to-face. And a lot of the people who probably carry out the actors are maybe people who are not very, very well acquainted with technology, with all these digital mechanisms. And so there's also need to find ways of how do we empower these community actors who are very critical at this moment for them to be able to continue carrying on the very important role that they play in ensuring that secure communities do not revert to violence, that there's peace and cohesion.
That's such an important point. We've actually been carrying a number of closed-door conversations on the engagement of youth and peace building through technology, and yeah, there is some fantastic work that is happening through digital tools. But you're right, it excludes more traditional leaders who are not accessing technology the same way. So there's definitely an area for reflection there. Let me come to a question from Ada Sonnenfeld, who is asking, Liv and others, and I'll come to Rodrigo as well to reflect on this. So I don't know who wants to start between Liv and Rodrigo. But Ada is asking, how would panelists define people-centered justice? We've referred to it a few times in this conversation. How do you distinguish it from regular justice? Is the difference that you prioritize the impacts of justice on human security over state security and stability, or what other definition would you give? Liv, do you want to start, or Rodrigo?
Me, it is not really about the difference between human security and state security. I think people-centered justice will be able to actually contribute to both. At point of departure, most of the funding globally when it comes to the justice system goes to the formal institutions, the courts, the Supreme Court, the police, etc. And with the identified justice problems and gaps that we saw already from before the pandemic and that have now been growing, we are underlining people-centered justice as a way to say that we need to transform the justice system, invest in justice that is closer to people. Institutions that are also often cheaper, but paralegals, legal conflict resolutions, lawyers available for access to, for people's access at the local level, local grassroots organizations, etc. Can I also mention one thing added to this, because there's been quite a few of us addressing how to make sure that local communities don't end up in conflict and violence breaks out. Now, South Africa had, Martin, I'm sure can say a lot more about this, but had this amazing setup in the early 90s that stemmed from the Truth Accord, the Peace Accord, sorry. The peace committees that were set up in the troubled areas of South Africa, where local communities that basically had different views on politics were forced to sit down and discuss them and find a way to go forward. This is a very simple way of describing a very complex and impressive structure, but post-conflict tools like that can be used by many communities as a prevention tool. This is the time to think prevention, and this is the time to think how to resolve conflicts, mediate grievances, and start doing that at the lowest possible level and as soon as possible before the conflicts have gone too far. Because there will be a competition for resources, and there will be desperate people trying to get access to resources for their own needs.
So if I can add my own reflection, I think people-centered justice has, the merit of focusing on the demand side capacity, basically the capacity for legal voice, for agency. And we haven't heard much about legal empowerment. And Rodrigo, perhaps you can reflect on that and how central that is to the whole people-centered justice thinking.
Sorry. Yes, I was going to say something very similar to what you have said, Sarah, and Liv, is that what I think, what I understood as people-centered justice is a system of justice that is centered on the legal needs of persons. That is, persons have some legal needs, if you can define them. Such as, for instance, I need to resolve this conflict. I have a problem with my neighbor. I have my labor right has been violated, and I need protection, etc. And they have these legal needs. And what has been showed is that, especially for the most disadvantaged person in society, these legal needs are unmet. And normally the judicial reforms are made taking into account the offer of justice and not the legal needs of persons. That is, you said, what are the needs of the judges? What is the structure of the judicial system? These things are important. I'm not saying that they are not important. But when you speak about people-centered justice, you said how we can satisfy these unmet legal needs of communities. And sometimes the best solution is to recognize the community's mechanisms of solving conflict that some communities have already in place. But in other cases, as Florence said, for instance, in urban areas, you have communities that don't have this traditional mechanism because urbanization have dissolved them. And so you have to create new mechanisms that can meet their needs. For instance, you can create, in Colombia, they have functioned more or less well, what we call the houses of justice, in which we try to mix different offers of justice to see what are best for people. So that's what I think of people-centered justice. And that has, and I finish with that, with legal empowerment. That is, that people understand that if they have legal needs, they should receive attention to these legal needs. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, on this point, let me come to you, Franz, because I think both, Colombia and Kenya have similar enabling constitutions, process mechanisms that I think create the opportunities for bottom-up legal empowerment. And so is there an opportunity we can take from COVID to use that, to really try and mitigate some of the challenges that we are seeing, in terms of the justice access?
Yes, that is very true, Sarah, that we have very enabling constitutions, and because they're very liberal and centered on very people-centered, I think that it is true that now what we need to do, especially with this COVID season, where the majority, actually, a lot of people cannot access courts, because if you're going to access court over Zoom, and you don't have, a smartphone, and there are many things that you require. So people are more likely to go to lawyers and therefore leave out the things that trouble them the most, the closest conflicts that they have. So I think that this is an opportunity, as Rodriguez has said, that even in communities that probably do not have well-structured systems, that it's possible, because people can now enter into discussions in neighborhoods to discuss what are the issues that they have within the neighborhoods, what are the common types of conflicts that they have, and what are the causes of these conflicts, how can they resolve them. And a lot of the conflicts, I was going to say, are also resource-based, because people are actually fighting for resources that are very scarce. And I think that in addition to enabling and empowering people to resolve their own problems, I think fundamentally states must begin to rethink how they distribute the wealth that they hold on behalf of the citizens of our countries. Because as long as we are sticking to this ideology of whether it is capitalism, and we are telling everybody that it's possible that this pie is going to be distributed this way, and COVID has exposed that it is not possible. So more just societies at the foundation, so that we reduce conflicts that are actually created by the system, and sometimes by the legal system itself. The political systems that we have are actually the main drivers of inequalities and injustice. So I think we really then, we also need to think along those fundamental lines.
I think you raise a very important point, and I'll come maybe to Martin and Lee for some reflections on that, because people-centered justice does not operate in a political vacuum. It is really important to probe what this means in the wider political settlement of a country. And so I think it's an important, in a way, a reality check that we need to have when we are, pushing for people-centered justice, in understanding how it is situated in a particular, political context, and what the opportunities are, which is something that Rodrigo's already alluded to. But I don't know, Martin, if you have any reflections on that in the context of South Africa in particular. You are muted. You are on mute. We can't hear you.
I think, yes, the organizers had muted me.
Oh, no. Yes.
No, it's interesting to note, Sarah, that on the African continent, only in 2004 did the African Union produce what they called a common defense and security policy, which allowed equal treatment to state security versus human security. And so we can say, in many, African countries, human security is a work in progress. Access to water, access to, to justice and rights, access to the courts, system, etc. All of that is really recent phenomena, and one is really dealing with a number of fragile states in which many of these norms and processes, in the African Union being, the norm setter on the continent, are still to be consolidated and embedded within, the lifestyles, that we hold. It's important also to acknowledge that I think progress has been made. On the one hand, acknowledging and strengthening, formal judicial systems, but also to the extent that all that is good within traditional and customary systems has been incorporated in the lifestyles. Of course, some elements that continue to be negative, etc. So we are at that phase of transition where, on paper, some work has been done, but in practice, we still have to find ourselves or find each other to make sure that, we consolidate and we begin. But COVID had governments almost adopting knee-jerk reactions of this model that some of us have described, in writing, as the Wuhan model, the Chinese town. What the Chinese did in shutting down this city of Wuhan when COVID was discovered appeared to be the default position of many states when they attempted to react. And certainly it marginalized or reduced the rights of citizens. And it is only later that the negative impact, both on the economy, on human rights, practices, was then noted. That I think as we go either post-COVID or even in the second wave, I don't think many countries will revert back to the original very harsh lockdown, where the thinking was that perhaps within 90 days or 30 days, we would find either a vaccine or a cure, but also allow the public health sector to be able to cope. It's important also, Sarah, to note that the presence of COVID-19 on the African continent was not as virulent as we have seen, in other parts. And so, the statistics have demonstrated that we were, as a continent, lucky to have minimal impact or manifestations of both affected victims and fatalities.
Thanks, Martin. I want to come back to Liv on, you quoted the Pathway for Peace report, and this has been incredibly rich and fantastic conversation in terms of bringing these very, rooted perspectives of what is happening, in different countries. What we haven't heard at all, apart from your reference to that report, is how this connects to these, sort of policy discussions around SDG 16 or, the sustaining peace sort of debate, and these policy silos that we have at global level, where they seem completely disconnected from, this very real, very rooted conversation that we're having here today.
Well, I think you are right. We are trying to sort of make the linkages all the time, of course, and there is a reason why we are focusing on inclusion, justice, and peace. And to put it very bluntly, when inequalities are growing and exclusion is growing and people have got no access to justice or anywhere to raise their grievances and get them solved, it easily explodes. And I think there's no doubt neither about the linkages between these three areas. There's also no doubt, I think, about the importance of these three areas for all the sustainable development goals. If there is no peace, if there is no justice, if there's not good governance, if inequality is increasing beyond a certain point and brings polarization, etc., it puts everything else in danger as well. Health, education, all the other goals. So I do think that is very important to repeat again and again. But can I address or go back to what Florence was raising, which I think is very important, which is the political side of this and the policy relevance of all of this. The inequalities that we had already and the injustices were created by our politicians, our structures, us humans. So when that, it didn't come as a force of nature. We created the structural challenges that we are now living with. We created the fragilities and fragmentation that became so apparent during the pandemic. We created the inequalities. We created the injustices, etc. Therefore, it's also in our power to change it and to improve the systems. Now, can I just say a couple of things at the very end here? Because I think the policies are crucial in order to address it. Not all of this is possible to do straight away, but the politicians are needed in order to address policy changes, how to restructure and transform the justice systems, etc. It cannot only be done by grassroots organizations, the organizations that we are working for, etc., etc. It needs politicians and political leadership. Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100% on that. I'm trying to really think what practical steps we can take from this, because it is very clear to me from everything that you've all said that that when we have obviously a justice global gap that is enormous. On the other hand, the pandemic creates new pressures. So what can we do creatively? You talked about creativity before, to try and think of when we leave this conversation, when we sort of go back to working on these issues, that we can sort of advance in terms of policy steps that we can propose. I don't know if who wants to answer that question, that first.
I can try. It depends on who you are and what's your position. If you are in government, as Liv said, some policies could be developed. For instance, we know already that the pandemic all over the world has increased inequalities and, for instance, domestic violence against women. And that access to justice, when you have restrictions of movement for women, becomes much more difficult. So if you know that you have to create very creative and specific policies to address that. For instance, reinforcement, access of women to some mechanisms of redress that can be used by telephone or without going directly to, for instance, a center to deal with these issues. So that's if you are in a government. If you are a judge, you have to understand that you cannot operate as usual, that you are in a very critical situation and you have to be creative without undermining the rule of law. I'm not sure that all judges have done that they think, okay, we cannot make in-person hearings, but that's not an issue. Yes, that's an issue. You have to be creative in order to keep the judicial system working in an emergency situation. If you are, as in my case now, in a human rights organization such as the Justicia, so you have to see how you can use the judicial system to or some judicial mechanisms in order to avoid the worst things of the pandemic. We have done that with and judicial action against discrimination of all persons. We are trying to do that with persons who have been excluded. I don't think that was the will of the government, but they were excluded from the social benefits to address income benefits to address the crisis, and we are saying with this judicial mechanism to the government to address the situation. So I think that it depends on what is your position.
That's very helpful. Martin, what would be your creative thought about how we can try and promote people's sense of justice?
Encouraging dialogue between public sector, the executive, and communities is an important path in the post-COVID or going forward. This is a pandemic which surprised, almost everyone, when it arrived, and the responses, many of them were not thought through. So my parting shot, Sarah, would be to encourage, corridors of dialogue, of consultation, and adopting policies that speak to people. Florence, indicated earlier, it is an area that some of us has done, a lot of work. The most impact of the pandemic were on the elderly, the disabled, the unemployed. And curiously, many countries, in fact, the UN has recorded indigenous, peoples who do not belong to any state, as it were. And this is a community that has been left out. So you have these, particular communities that going forward, I think widespread consultation and dialogue can capture and not allow many of these to fall through the cracks.
Florence.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. It's raining cats and dogs in Nairobi.
Sorry, that's being
So okay, yeah. So I think that this has been really interesting, and for me, I think one of the reflections that I've had is just as those who are interested in human rights, I think that for some time there's been this tendency to concentrate on maybe civil and political rights, and then other people are concentrating on economic and social rights. And I think that the pandemic has brought to us the reality that human rights are truly interconnected. They are interrelated. And that in going forward, that we really do have to, whichever area we decide we are working on, we have a responsibility to keep that message and make that message very clear to those we are engaging with, to governments, to private sector, and most importantly, to the communities that we work with. Because I think that communities that have suffered so much, I think that a lot of them, if their experiences were to be documented and, in a way that can give us much more clarity on how this pandemic has demonstrated this interrelatedness, and the fact that, when government strikes one right down, that, we could be very stressed about our freedom of movement. But our freedom of movement is connected to our freedom of the right to health, the right to housing, the right to water. All these rights are so interconnected. And so I think for us, it's an opportunity to really find new ways of engaging with communities in a way that empowers them, and for them to see the connections, and also to see the connections between politics, corruption, and all those things that undermine their rights at a very, very fundamental level. Because I think that in line with a lot of countries, like, I don't know about other countries, but in Kenya, the pandemic has also just once again demonstrated how corrupt the system can be, and how they can take advantage of even something that is so terrible to actually undermine the rights of those who are most vulnerable. So I think it's very important for us to make those connections so that these movements that we are talking about, the grassroots movements, see the connection, and when they are agitating, they know that they are agitating from a very collective perspective.
Very powerful. And no, it's not just in Kenya. The corruption has been so rampant in the pandemic. Sadly, it's very present, here, close to home here as well. They discuss it better. Let's put it that way. Liv.
Well, I think there's been a lot of good suggestions and focus areas already: dialogue, innovation, exchange of experiences, importance of local actors. I'd like to add also a sort of a need for the politicians and the justice leaders themselves to address transformation and gradual change of budgets, making sure that the justice actors closer to people will actually get more funding. But let me also add, without sort of repeating a lot of the other good comments that have been added, let me also say at the very end that we all have a responsibility. At point of departure, we have a responsibility for the societies and the world we live in. But in a crisis, we have an extra layer of responsibilities. Now, politicians and state actors have a responsibility to assure that there are policies in place in order to stop the corruption and prevent corruption in COVID assistance and management. A lot of them are delivering on this. I'm not saying, when I'm now handing out responsibilities, I'm not saying that none of this is done. There are some great examples, but I also do think that many could do more. Politicians have a responsibility. Employers have a responsibility. If they don't have to retrench people, why should they do that? Maybe the politicians should have said in countries that there's a moratorium on retrenchments, keep the labor force you have, because at this time we need to be very, very careful. People are vulnerable. Maybe the politicians should have said to the corporate sector that this is the time to sit down with the employees, show them your books and what money you have available, and figure out the plan for how you can get through this. Maybe this is the time for the corporates to take responsibilities, the same way that civil society. I mean, we are in a crisis together. So I think it's up to many actors, civil society, business, states, to share that responsibility and sit down and talk about how this social contract can be made better and deliver better to those that need it most. And make sure, I'd like to add that, although it's been mentioned before, make sure that the justice system and the conflict resolution and the inequality, the distribution of resources, is not based on discrimination, racial biases, ethnic biases, etc. I do think that communities are actually quite resilient if they sit down and are explained that we have limited resources, but they want to share it equally. They want to see that they actually figure out a way to deal with the crisis together, and that services, policing, resources, etc., is not distributed based on discrimination.
Thank you. Wow, what a powerful discussion. I've been taking notes all along. I'm going to attempt to sort of sum up 3 or 4 key points that I take from this discussion, but I think we could have carried on for a long time, because I think we were just getting into the interesting thing about what we do next. But just for the sake of our colleagues who are listening, let me bring out what I think have been the key points of the discussion. I think, COVID, clearly the pandemic, as on everything, has made, the experience of accessing justice all the more challenging. It's made more difficult getting legal needs addressed, and it's reinforced patterns of exclusion, of impunity, difficult access to dispute resolutions, remedy, basic protection, everything you've mentioned over the past hour and a half. It has worsened violence. We've heard about violence against women, domestic violence, but also conflict, crime-related violence. It's made actually crimes more invisible. And and it's clearly exacerbated human rights vulnerabilities. And you know, like Florence, you were saying, as reduce the civic space as a result of the COVID measures, and the point that Martin made as well. But I think in we've also heard very strongly from all of you that in a way this has created a moment of reflection. All of you are reflecting on what we could have done, we can still do, we need to do. As I was saying before, there is a global justice gap that needs to be closed, and maybe we need to use this moment of opportunity to really push, for this change, to create, this transformation, to really think of how we can do it differently. And so when it comes to, what we can do to use the pandemic also as a moment of opportunity and not just a moment of, stress and that exacerbated a lot of the negative side, a lot of you, talked about creativity, and you talked about a set of different ideas and pathways, but a lot of it was really how we use this moment really to make progress on things that we were all working perhaps at different levels, at the policy level, at the practice level, but really, as Rodrigo said, making sure that whatever your position, whatever your job, whatever you're doing, whatever your organization can do, that we do it, that we use this as a moment to advance, this change, that we use this moment to think about different ways of doing it. Digital came up a couple of times, how we can make sure that we use that, the technology better, how we make sure that we create or strengthen these corridors of dialogue, that Martin mentioned. And Florence, I think you made a very, very powerful and important point in terms of the interrelatedness of human rights. A lot of these collective sort of grassroots movements have sprung up during the pandemic, have taken the streets. It's really important to make sure that this connection of human rights is brought to bear, so that this collective action becomes stronger, becomes, more rooted in the demands, for change that they need to make. And as Liv, you concluded, we all have responsibility in this. And depending on where we sit, we really need to push for this change to happen, and to happen fast. At the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a blog, the title for which was, we can't go back to normal because normal was the problem, and which was inspired by, the Chilean slogan during the protests last year. And I strongly believe that we need to use this moment, as you said, Liv, to work, whether we are employers or, to push corporates, to push governments, as citizens, to demand that change that is essential, because a lot of these fractures existed before the pandemic. The pandemic has brought them out more vividly, as, brought them into stark relief, but we can't allow, this year to have gone to waste and go back to where we were before, with the addition of, the burden economically, socially, that the pandemic has created. So it's a bit of a sort of rallying call to continue to talk and continue to plan and continue to, think how we can connect to demand this change, so that, we push for remedial sort of action where is needed, that we allow, that we help people have the legal empowerment that is required to make sure that nobody is discriminated against. As I said, there is no racial biases in the access to justice that we see, that we just have fairer, more equal access going forward. With that, thank you very, very, very much for what has been an incredibly powerful, interesting conversation. I look forward to continue to engage with you. Thank you to the audience, especially those who are in Africa, in Europe, where it's quite late. Be easier for colleagues in the US. But yeah, great conversation. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to moderate.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.